Now, our subject for today is work experience and work in the UK, and particularly focused on the needs of international students, so students who may not be ordinarily resident in the UK. And so that's what we're going to focus on. What you will gain from this webinar is a lot, I hope. I'm really aiming for this to be a really practical and useful session for you. Got quite a lot of material that I'll cover with you over the next 45 minutes or so. Please do feel free to type in questions or comments as we go along, and I'll do my very best to give you answers to those, and Mark will be supporting with that as well as we go through the webinar. So look forward to having your participation during the session. What you'll gain from this webinar are four main things. So some key tips on how to look for work in the UK. Also, when to look, because the timing of looking for work in the UK is a really critical factor. We'll look at some significant methods for success. So what you can do to really help yourself to be successful, and including in that some activities which get overlooked by many students. And if you decide to do them, you can immediately put yourself in with a really good chance of being successful with your job search. And we'll look at a few current ideas and resources, and look at some further places that you can look in order to take your job search for work or work experience in the UK further. So without further ado, let's work through on those four key areas, and we'll take them in turn. This is a fairly structured webinar, but as we go through, as I've said, if you have questions, thoughts or ideas, please just pop those into the chat box and we'll be happy to tackle those either at the time or I'll come back to them later in the webinar. Just to give us a feel for who's on the webinar today, we're just going to do a quick poll. So you'll see questions coming up on a poll, and I'd just like you to put in your answer on one of the 5 boxes about your current status as a student. That'll be really helpful for us. And also you'll see the results of the poll so that you can get a feel for who else is with you on the webinar today. I'll just wait a moment for some of your responses to come in. Great, looks like everyone's getting a handle on the how the poll is working. Okay, I'm just going to see if we can get those results visible for you. Okay, so it looks as if we have a majority of people on the webinar so far who are graduating this year and are non-EU students. Now that doesn't mean I'm going to exclude the rest of you, because a number of you are graduating this year and are EU students. Some of you are still current students and are EU students. So what we're going to cover is relevant for all of you, and a lot of it is particularly relevant for those of you who are graduating this year and are non-EU students. So that's great in terms of our focus today. Thanks for completing that poll. Okay, so let's begin with how to look for work in the UK. Now, there are 6 main activities that I would strongly suggest you build into your work search strategy for the UK. 6 is a lot, so that doesn't mean you've got to be doing all of these day in, day out, but by doing some activity in each of these 6 areas, you're really equipping yourself to have an effective job search in the UK. What's an effective job search? One that results in work or work experience for you. Now, just to give you a bit of detail on each of these, so applying to advertised jobs, seeing a job advertisement, and then making an application as a result of that. Second box, if we follow across the screen, is to make direct approaches to employers, and I'll tell you a bit more about what I mean by that in a moment, but it's about when a job hasn't necessarily been advertised but you still want to apply for a role. Thirdly, and as we come down the grid, networking. Now, the networking term is one which is unpopular with most students, and indeed people further on in their careers as well. But we'll look at ways that you can network which make it comfortable for you and produce results for you. And linked to that, informational interviews and work shadowing. So ways of looking for work which are about meeting people to gain information and understand more about roles. We'll also think about the value of volunteering And the sixth strategy, how to be visible on social media. And of course, visible in a good way. So using social media in a way that supports your job search. So 6 key areas. As I said, that's a lot of activity, but what will enable you to do is to pick out from those 6 areas the ones which you feel are going to work best for you and look at some practical ways that you can put those into working for you. So let's have a look at the first of those then. And the first one is how to apply for advertised jobs. I would expect that this is an area which comes to mind for most of you when you think about looking for work in the UK, and may also link to the way that you would look for work in your home country. There are many, many different sources of job adverts in the UK, and as you look under the blue banner that we've got there, you'll see we've put a list of example resources for you where you'll find lots and lots of jobs listed. And the good thing about the resources that we've listed there is that they are largely focused on people at your stage, so students who have just graduated or graduating this year or are currently students. So examples include the website provided by the University of London, which currently has over 2,500 jobs listed on it. That's the Job Online, the Careers Group website. There are in the UK certain other major organisations which focus on the graduate job market as well, and those include Target Jobs, Milkround, Inside Careers. One I would add to this, and I've heard some good feedback from students just in the last couple of days, is Indeed as well, so INDEED. So there's always new sites coming onto the market. Don't feel that you've got to cover every job search site. You could spend all day, every day doing that. What you'll find helpful is to pick out certain key sites that really work for you. And you've seen I'll include it on there, linkedin.com, so second from bottom on the list. LinkedIn is mainly a social networking site, but increasingly has jobs listed on it, and it's worth keeping an eye on what jobs are listed there. Now, job advertisements vary greatly because jobs vary greatly. So on this slide as well, you'll see that we're covering the 2 different types of graduate level work or types of graduate roles which you can consider applying for. The first bullet point there covers graduate or internship schemes with major employers. Now, these are the most high-profile schemes that you will come across. They are often marketed quite strongly by employers and may be advertised across a number of different sites. So because of that advertising, it can seem like they are the main opportunities in the market. In fact, in terms of numbers of opportunities for people at your level of education and experience, graduate schemes are not the largest source of employment. The other main source of employment is, let's look at the second point, graduate level jobs. Okay, so what's the difference? They're similar terms, aren't they? But one is a graduate scheme, one is graduate level work. The difference in many cases is the size of employer. Large employers tend to run schemes where they may be taking on between 10, sometimes up to several hundred people in a year globally, and they will run a specific scheme to integrate those people into their organisation. Smaller organisations, so small and medium-sized enterprises, and in the UK that means organisations, say, of up to 250 people, as you'll understand, they're not taking on tens or hundreds of graduates each year. They may be taking 2 or 5. And as a result, they don't run big programmes, but they do have great, interesting roles which are at a graduate level. And they offer those both in terms of permanent jobs and in terms of internships and temporary work. And most graduate opportunities are with small and medium-sized companies for the simple reason that actually small and medium-sized companies make up the majority of the UK economy. So don't be distracted by the fact that the marketing spend of the larger organisations means that their graduate schemes are very visible, and don't overlook the fact that lots of graduate level opportunities exist with other types of organisations. You'll find both on these sites listed here and others, and we will during this webinar look at other ways of identifying particularly graduate level work which can be really helpful for you. So a bit more about how to look for work in the UK and moving on to making direct approaches. What is a direct approach? Well, as the title suggests, it's when you make an approach directly to an employer. So rather than waiting for them to decide that they need to take on a graduate and that they're going to put some money into advertising that role, remember advertising positions is actually quite expensive for employers. You can decide actually, there are certain organisations I would like to work for in the UK, and you can target them directly. And by targeting them directly, what we mean simply is communicating with them directly. That can be as simple as writing them an email, making a phone call to them, simply stating your interest in working for them. For some students, I know that can feel like a really bold move and almost perhaps a little bit raising the question, do I have the right to do that? Surely if an employer wanted somebody, they'd put out an advert. Actually, the reality tells us, and when we speak to employers, we really learn that they value getting direct approaches from you as students. And one of the main reasons they value it is because then they know that you're really motivated to work for them. So whatever your area of study, something I would really encourage you to do if you're seeking work or work experience in the UK is to identify a target list of employers who you would like to work for. Then go on and research more about what that organisation does and some things about their USPs. So USPs are unique selling points. Really simply put, it's, well, what does this company do? Who does it do it for in terms of who are its customers? And what makes it good at it? Why is it successful? Why is it competing well amongst in a competitive industry, for example? Just understanding some of the basic reasons why that company does business and is successful. I'm using the term company, and I want to make clear I'm using that broadly. We could be talking about organisations which are in the not-for-profit sector or in the public sector. The same approach applies. In order to find organisations, you can find it helpful to use some directories and listings, because you might find as you sit down and think, oh yeah, who do I want to work for? You come up maybe with a list of 2 or 3 companies, but think, oh, well, I need to add some more to that. So again, looking under the blue box, there's a list of example resources, and you'll see at the top of that is compass.com. Compass.com is a database of companies, including the UK, but actually globally. You can access it for free. You can search for company by location and by activity type. So as you listen to this webinar, if you know, for example, that you are particularly interested in seeking opportunities linked to the field of, let's take an example, logistics and operations. You could do a search on logistics and operations companies, and that will bring up a useful list of organisations for you and get you beyond companies which might immediately be within your knowledge base. Once you've identified some target companies, then a really important thing to do is simply to put together a clear CV and cover letter. The cover letter these days is most likely to be sent as part of an email, so just something brief which sets out why you're interested in the organisation and what it is about you, which means that you've got some skills that are relevant for that organisation. And one of the things as an international student which can be very valuable to companies is your what we call kind of global graduate credentials, and I will talk to you a little bit more about that later on in this webinar. So in fact, making direct approaches is a pretty simple technique for deciding who you want to approach, finding out more about them, and then communicating with them directly, either via phone or email. The key point to remember is that however good your direct approach, you're likely to be approaching people at a time when they are very busy. People are generally busy, so you'll probably need to follow up on this approach. It's not realistic to expect that an organisation is perhaps going to immediately call you back. You may need to call them or send a follow-up email. Be determined, be resilient, and this approach can really, really work well for you. So moving on to the 4 remaining sections of the 6 which I said we would cover in terms of how to look for work in the UK. So we've covered applying to advertised vacancies, making direct approaches. Now let's look at the remaining 4 boxes. I'm going to keep all of those on the screen and talk through them in turn. So firstly, volunteering. Some of you may feel that actually having studied and paid to study in the UK and perhaps gained some work experience during the time of your studies, volunteering is not something that you feel is a viable option for you at the moment. And sometimes from a very practical point of view, it can be tricky to volunteer if you need to be paying to live and work in the UK. However, I would suggest that you consider volunteering even on a temporary basis or even on quite a small scale basis as a way of getting to know organisations. And this is really sector dependent. There are some sectors in which volunteering is very much still a regular way of gaining entry to the sector, and the not-for-profit sector remains one of those. I'm not going to discuss the sort of rights and wrongs of that on this webinar, but it is useful to talk to people in your chosen area that you'd like to get into and understand, well, actually, what might help me to get in here, and would actually doing a week's volunteering with an organisation, perhaps just as you finish your studies, so while you're still within the terms of your current visa, might that be something actually that in the long run could prove to be really helpful for you? But just to be clear, I'm not at all suggesting that in terms of looking for work in the UK, you approach companies or organisations with lots of broad offers to be giving your time away for free. This isn't about you needing or that being a viable or a suggested option. But sometimes little particular pieces of volunteering with chosen organisations can be useful in terms of opening up opportunities for you. Similar to that, and definitely linked if we move across the screen to the idea of informational interviews and work shadowing. So again, these are opportunities for which you are unlikely to be paid, but the benefit for you is that you gain information, ideas and understanding, which is then very useful for you in your ongoing job search. An informational interview, simply put, is meeting up with somebody or having a phone call with somebody or even exchanging information via email to understand more about the work that they do, how they do it, how they got into it. And that can really provide you with some very helpful data and knowledge which you can then use in your own applications. Similarly, work shadowing can be useful. And one concern which I hear voiced by many students is that employers want you to have experience, but in order to get experience, you need to have experience. And it can seem like an impossible circle to break into. Well, work shadowing and informational interviewing can be one way to break into that cycle. So, for example, if you're hoping to get into a field related to law, which is a notoriously competitive field, if you can arrange perhaps to speak with or shadow for an afternoon somebody who is working in an area that you're interested in, then you can gain some insights and maybe even gain some practical experience or knowledge which you can refer to in a cover letter or on your CV. So simply put, the term work shadowing here in the UK means working alongside somebody for a brief period of time, perhaps half a day, a week maximum, to gain more understanding of what they do. You're not doing practical work yourself, but as the term shadow suggests, you're alongside somebody else as they do their job. I know that in the area that I work in, we quite regularly get requests from people to work shadow, and we very often say yes to that. So people will come in, they'll perhaps observe us doing a workshop or doing different sessions, and it's a way that people find out about our industry. So a bit like the direct approach is important to remember that it's always okay to ask. Not everybody's going to say yes to your request, but simply asking is a really good idea because some people will say yes, and that opens some very important doors for you. Now, the term networking appears on this page, doesn't it? I don't want to assume that it's a term which brings negative thinking for many of you, but I do know from working with lots of students and international students that the term networking can be one that feels uncomfortable, particularly if you're networking with people in the UK where you maybe don't have English as your first language, or you feel that culturally you might not be as au fait with the different ways of approaching things in the UK as you could be. I'm going to suggest that it's useful for you to put those concerns to one side and to look at finding ways of simply being in touch and communicating with employers that are going to help you. And a really useful start point for any networking activity that you have is to just think, well, What is it that you'd like to find out by networking? What are your key questions? Perhaps a question might be, well, what are the opportunities in my chosen industry for people from my country, or something related to that? So you may have particular questions. The research tells us that people like to be approached for information, helps them to feel expert, respected, it acknowledges their status. And you can either do that in person, or you can, as this slide suggests, use some of the social media networks to help you with that. So following organisations on Twitter, and many organisations now have their own careers department Twitter feeds, particularly the larger ones, or individuals from within an organisation are on Twitter. And it can be a way of making connections with an organisation, which is much less reliant on you having to meet somebody at an event or feel that you've got to pluck up too much courage in order to be in touch with someone. So think about your questions and then think about different ways that you might like to get in touch with people. Remember too, and particularly for those of you who are continuing students, that it's always great to get along to as many careers events organised by your university as you can, because often you'll be able to meet employers there and you'll get valuable information from speaking with them, or they may help you with further contacts, and it builds your confidence as well in terms of getting to know people. And connected to the idea of networking, so being in touch with people, let's move on to the final of the 4 blocks on this page. So the being visible on social media. And as we said, being visible in a good way. And by that I mean having a presence which represents you as somebody who is aspiring to work in the UK and has skills to offer to the UK workplace. And there is nothing complex about that. One of the most useful things that you can do is build a LinkedIn profile. LinkedIn, you'll find it by Googling it. I expect I've got the link somewhere in this presentation. If I haven't, then simply Google LinkedIn. It now has something like 50 million users worldwide. It's gone from being something which was seen as useful to almost being seen now as essential in terms of having a professional presence on the web. So start to build a basic LinkedIn profile if you don't have one already. But even if you do have one, for those of you who are graduating or for all of you who are finishing a certain level of your studies, it's a nice point in the year to just update your LinkedIn profile and to make sure that the skills and summary that you've got on there is representative of who you are now. And perhaps even update your photo so that it represents you well. It's all about just having a simple, visible presence so that if people get your CV or hear about you and want just to search for you on LinkedIn, they can and they will find you. Your LinkedIn profile does not have to be completely comprehensive, but it does need just to show that you're there. And if you like, it's a reinforcement, or another word for it could be a way of reassuring employers that you are the type of person who they would want to work with in their organisation, because you present yourself professionally on LinkedIn, and so they could imagine that you would do that on behalf of their organisation. Okay, now having covered those 6 areas of how to look for work in the UK, I'm just going to check in with Mark to see whether we've got any questions which have come through that it makes sense for me to take at this point. So just a moment's silence while I just check in with him as to whether we have. Yeah, so a really good question about whether students should attend careers fairs early on in their studies. So do you leave it until your 3rd year when you might be thinking, well, now's the time because I'm ready to graduate, so I'll have some really productive conversations and it's time to do something about it? Or do you attend earlier? Well, my very strong suggestion is to get started as soon as possible. So right from the first term of your 1st year. And I say that not because I'm a careers consultant and I really want to fill up the events that we run. I say it really strongly because it is in your interest to get to know employers as soon as possible, because it will help you to be informed about the career decisions which you want to make as you go through. It will build your confidence, it will build your contacts, and really importantly, you'll find out about opportunities for gaining work experience during your studies. And a definite trend in the UK employment market is that employers like to employ people who they have got to know during their studies when it comes to graduate programs. And that comes back a little bit to the networking idea, but also a simple risk management approach from employers that they want to minimize the risk of taking on people who have never worked with them before. So work experience opportunities or internships do come up during your studies. So by getting along to events, engaging with careers as early as possible, you'll be in a position to know the most about those that you can and make the most of opportunities, and that can really make a difference for you. I'll share some input from a student who successfully gained experience in the UK, and it's one of the things that he suggests, and we'll have a look at that in just a moment. Okay, thanks for that question. Keep them coming in. Now, just on the subject of networking, a chance for a poll, just to check you're all still out there. I hope that you are. Put us in your answers, see what you think. What percentage of students would you guess found their job as a result of networking? This is stats that I have from 2013. Would you guess that that was less than 10%, 10 to 20%, or over 20%? Again, just a couple of moments silence from me while we wait for those poll answers to come in. Oh. Okay. All right. Thanks for getting your answer to the poll coming in. And while I'm just giving you a couple more mo's just to put your answers in on that, another great question's come in about how to open conversations with employers at careers fairs. What a good question. And I think it's an area which quite a lot of students feel concerned about. You know, will I look an idiot if I go up and talk to somebody? Will they think, you know, will I ruin my chances the moment I open my mouth? Really, it's one thing to remember is employers understand that you'll feel a bit nervous about approaching them at a careers fair. A key way to open the conversation can simply be to ask them about how they started doing the work that they do, or what do they most enjoy about working for their organisation, or what do they think it's most important for undergraduates or students thinking of working in their industry to be aware of. So just ask a typical open question like that. So something like, what do they enjoy? How do they get into working in the industry that they work in? What do students need to know? And that will get the conversation going. Most of the people who are chosen to come along to represent employers at careers fairs are fairly good at chatting and setting you at your ease. If they're not, then that's not your responsibility. Carry on asking the questions that you need to know, and you'll hopefully get some useful information. So good luck with asking those questions. And again, it's another reason for getting along to fairs and things as early as possible so that you get into practice of asking people questions and just talking to employers and remembering that actually they're people as well, and they may have been in the same situation as you as students just a very short number of years back. So there's no need to feel too scared of them. Okay, let's see what poll results are coming in. What do we think? So, what percentage of students found their job as a result of networking in 2013? Oh, a bit of a tie here going on between 10 to 20% and over 20%. So all of you are guessing that actually it's quite a significant number, and hence we've covered it on this webinar. Yeah. 22% of students found their jobs as a result of networking in 2013, and I would expect that statistic to remain consistent, because even though the economy is constantly changing in the UK, the fact is, and we're still seeing this trend of employers wanting to work with people who they've already had some contact with, and the reality that not all jobs do get advertised. So Please don't hear this fact about networking as being an indication that you have to have family or well-made connections in a certain industry in order to be successful. That isn't what this is about. What it is about is taking what we'd call a proactive approach. So really being active yourself in seeking out opportunities and contacts so that employers know about you and they know how motivated you are to work for their organisation and in their industry. And then that really increases your chances of success. Now, we've talked a little bit about timing, haven't we, in terms of when to go to fairs and things. Now let's move on to look at the timing of when to look for work in the UK. The simple answer, despite all of the words on this page, are all year round. So, two main factors in this. If you want to work for a large employer who runs a graduate scheme, you do need to be aware that the majority of those schemes will open over the summer. So look out for the ones which are going to be coming up, opening August 2015, and you apply August to September onwards. Sometimes the closing dates will carry over into 2016. More often they're around November and December of this year. Now remember, that is if you are going to start work, so not apply, but start work in 2016, probably around July 2016. So they're recruiting almost 12 months ahead. There's a really long lead time on recruitment for these large schemes. That's not true everywhere, but it certainly is a broad pattern within the UK, so something really important to be aware of. So don't leave it too late is the main message from that. Now, remember though that when we talked earlier about graduate schemes, I was very keen for you to retain the information that not all jobs for graduates in the UK are on graduate schemes. In fact, the majority of graduate roles and graduate level work is outside of graduate schemes. And those are roles which you can apply for all year round, either advertised roles or roles that you're going to find yourself through direct approaches to employers. Key difference here is that the lead times are shorter, partly because you're tending to be applying to smaller organisations which can be more dynamic in their approach to recruitment and perhaps haven't got global decision-making processes going on. So for these types of roles, so graduate level roles, perhaps with smaller and medium-sized enterprises, you would apply, say, 2 to 3 months before you finish your studies or 2 to 3 months before you start work. So as we're doing this webinar in June, for those of you who are doing dissertations over the summer, if you're postgraduate students, it's 2 to 3 months before you finish your studies. For others of you, finishing your studies is around now. It doesn't mean that you've missed your opportunity if you're applying now, but be aware that there is a lead time. So what does this mean? I guess what I'm suggesting is, while I want you all to have wonderful summers and a great break, it's important to remember that the next few months could be quite a critical time in your job search. So remembering to look for graduate schemes, which will be advertised in August and September. Look back at that slide that we did, and we'll share these with you afterwards on where to look for advertised roles, but also a 2 to 3 month lead time on applying for graduate level roles with any type of organisation. So if you apply now, you might realistically be starting in a role in September, October, and that's the kind of time when I know lots of students are very keen to start working. Another thing which we are keen to cover with you today is methods for success. So we've talked about what to do, we've talked about when to do it. This is a bit about how to do it. And I've worked for a number of years with students in different sectors, often in very competitive sectors like finance. And what I have noticed is that the how you plan your job search and your strategy really makes a big difference. And a key suggestion I have for you today is to spread your risk. And by that, I mean increase your chances of success. Spread your risk by applying to a mix of organisations by size. So back to this point that you may want to apply for some big company programs, and that it makes sense to absolutely combine that with approaches to small or medium-sized companies. And that's likely to mean then a combination of job applications to advertise vacancies and direct approaches. And the result of that combination will be a job or an internship. Going to take a question which is likely to come up around, well, does it make sense to apply now for a job, i.e. a permanent role, or an internship? The answer to that is that it depends to some extent on your industry. But if you're approaching an employer you've never worked with before and they're advertising internships and permanent roles, bear in mind this trend that we're seeing for lots of employers to take on people for their permanent roles from their internship programs. So it can tactically work for you to apply for an internship to get in on that basis and then take a permanent role. However, you need to take into account timings, visa terms, etc., and into your decision making there. But from a strategy point of view, it's useful to think sometimes about an internship being a way of getting in the door and then a permanent role resulting from that. Just like to draw your attention to the tip at the bottom of this page as well about keeping a focus on the type of work that you want to do and using that as a way of identifying organisations, using things like the database Compass, etc., that I talked about earlier. So you might, and taking another example from finance, you might think, yeah, I'd love to work in asset management. Oh, I know JP Morgan is a big player in asset management. They certainly are. So great to apply for them. Of course, the risk is, because lots of people know that JP Morgan is a big player in asset management, lots and lots of other people will apply. So for every role that they have, JP Morgan may well receive 200 to 250 applications. So think about applying to smaller companies as well. So an example of a smaller company in asset management is Ignis Asset Management, and I've popped their website in here. They don't disclose how many applications they receive, but the ratio of applicants to roles will be much lower for a company which is far less high in profile than JP Morgan. And the quality of experience that you get and exposure in the industry can be just as valuable. So bear those things in mind. That's a finance example, but that kind of way of thinking about where the work is applies to most industries that you might be thinking about working within. Oh, excuse me, I just missed a slide there. So just to recap a little bit, graduate schemes and internships are high profile because large employers spend to promote them. They do not cover all the opportunities available, in fact, far less than 50%. Do include small and medium-sized companies in your applications, and by that I mean companies which have, say, around up to 250 employees or £10 million turnover per year. That happens to be the UK definition of a small and medium-sized enterprise. So remember, small and medium-sized enterprises do recruit graduates, even if they don't advertise programs. Remember that. In terms of getting your targets together, a really useful approach is to get a target list of 40 employers together. So I've put these doors on this page because it can feel like, oh, where on earth do I turn? Getting yourself a target list of 40 employers together is a great idea. And in the last few years, I've been really struck by how often the number 40 comes up with students when I'm working with them on direct approaches. The student who I worked with recently who'd managed to organise an internship in a really competitive industry said, yeah, I approached 40 companies. I got a number of no's. I got some interviews and some informational interviews with a few of them, and it was actually the 40th company that said yes to me. Now that is hard work, isn't it? I think many people could forgive you for giving up at number 35 or perhaps number 39. But remember, you do need resilience to approach the UK market, as you well do in any market where you might be seeking work, whether in the UK or elsewhere. So remember that you have lots of relevant skills. Employers are interested in you. That doesn't mean that they will all say yes, but keep on going, and that will deliver results for you. A little quick tip here from an employer, linking into the methods of success, because the time that you spend on your applications to be at those 40 companies, you want that time to work really well for you. So remember that if you're a student of the University of London, you can get some support from your careers service. He'll be happy and open over the summer to look at any applications that you're making, to give you feedback on cover letters or on direct approaches that you're making. And bear this quote in mind. So this came from a senior recruiter with a major UK employer. I'll just give you a moment to read it. And while I'm doing that, I'll just check in with Mark about whether we have any questions. Okay, so some really insightful questions coming in, and I'll just come on to those. Just run through this quote with you though, as you have read it. So important when you're approaching companies that you give them a feel of your motivation towards them as an employer and your understanding of what they do. And that sounds simple, doesn't it? But remember that if you do that and do it well, you'll be really helping yourself to stand out, because lots of people approach organisations and really focus on what they want. So I'll see lots of applications from students who approach employers and say, oh, I'd like to work for a global organisation that provides great training and your organisation looks like it does. Actually, that doesn't really convey to the organisation that you want to work for them per se. It says you want to work for a global organisation, but a number of organisations could meet those requirements. So doing some research to show that you understand that organisation and want to work for them is really, really helpful and will absolutely help your application to stand out. So I'd really encourage you to do that. Couple of questions that have come in. One question was, how do I find graduate programs with small and medium-sized enterprises? Well, a short answer to that is that you probably won't find programs. You will find roles advertised. You may on occasion need to go direct to the company's own website to do that. So remember, use databases that we've listed in this webinar so far to identify the companies themselves. Use your informational interviewing, etc., to find out about other organisations. Typically, because of the size of smaller companies, they're not running big programs, and so you won't find a program itself advertised, but you will find roles. And remember too that often the roles that you find, the feedback that graduates give on those types of roles, that they often get immediate, real responsibility and interesting exposure to issues within the business, perhaps sometimes more quickly than they would if they were on a program with a bigger organisation. So there's definitely pros and cons. Okay, just one other question I'll address just now is one which has come in from somebody saying, well, I'm a few years on in my career and I want to use some skills which I had earlier in my career, which aren't necessarily directly shown in a master's which I have done. We're often in situations where we're needing to help employers understand the whole range of what we offer. And so I would really encourage you to think about how you're going to put all of that together, say in a cover letter or in your CV, and to use as your starting point for that, coming back to this idea of researching an organisation and understanding what they need. Because when you understand what they need, you can bring, both from current studies or current work experience or earlier studies, earlier work experience, you can bring a selection of your most relevant skills and experience to show to the organisation that you have what they need. So doing some matching of what they want and what you bring. So again, I would really encourage you not to feel that you don't fit with the UK market. Employers actually are very open to taking on people who have what they need, and they're often not too fussed about whether that means that they graduated in the last 6 months or a little bit longer ago. And they'll recognise that if you have some work experience or you've taken some time before doing further study, you may bring with you a greater commercial awareness, etc., than somebody who's fresh out of study may have. Although, as I say that, I can hear all of you who are fresh out of study saying, well, I'm actually really commercially aware. So it's not one's right and one's wrong, but it's about, really seeing the benefits of the situation that you're in and making those clear to an employer. Now, instead I give you some other direct contacts about places that you can look for employers and thinking about methods of success. So 3 points really to cover on this slide, which I'd like you to retain. One is a very practical one around if you're an international student, particularly non-EU based, you will, if you're seeking permanent employment after the expiry of your student visa, need to be able to gain sponsorship for your visa status. Now, the UK government provides this list, and so that's the top link on this slide, of a listing of sponsors, so organisations which have already sponsored people for a grade 2, type 2, tier 2 is the word I'm looking for, a tier 2 or a tier 5 visa. Now, this webinar is not about covering different visa types with you. Again, from your institution that you're a student with, you'll be able to get information about that. And I would encourage you to get good information about that kind of thing so that you know. But just to touch on it here, by using this link, you'll find a list of employers. Two things to remember. It's a really long list. It's got several thousand names on it, and it's not all that digestible. The other thing to remember is that just because an employer is not on this list does not mean that they cannot sponsor you for a visa. They still can. Okay, so this is just historically saying who has already done it. Of course, if they have done it in the past, you can take that as some indication that they're open and willing to do that in the future. So a useful list, albeit a little bit difficult to use because of the volume of it, but also useful to remember that it's not exclusive. So don't feel that if an employer is not on there, you can't approach them. You definitely can. Now, dipping down to the final point on this slide, saying that you definitely can. If you're approaching an employee who hasn't previously supported somebody who needs needs visa support to work in the UK, they might feel, oh, hang on a minute, that all sounds difficult. It all sounds complicated. Gosh, is it really worth our while? I'm not saying it's right for them to feel that way, because actually the feedback from employers who have gone through these processes is that they are relatively simple and also not very expensive. So one thing you can do is really increase your knowledge about what it takes for an employer to sponsor you. And for students of the University of London, there is a link here which you can see under careers tagged on this bottom URL on this slide. And if you do a search for international students or recruiting international grads, guide for employers, the terms in here, it will bring you up a brief one-page guide, useful for you to know, and it's also something which you could always forward to an employer if they were starting to ask you questions about, well, hang on, yeah, you sound great, but actually what would it mean for us to sponsor you? Of course, the middle point counts as well, and we've talked about the lead times on recruitment. So building relationships ahead of time really helps an employer to get to know you and to want to take you on, so that actually any conversations about visa status and support become part of the conversation around how they get you as an employee because they want you. And so strategically, it's very useful to pitch the kind of visa conversation as actually just part of their getting what they want and need, which is to have you as an employee. So do take a look at those resources, and I think they'll prove useful for you. A little bit now on one particular visa type, and I mention it here because it can often become overlooked, and yet it's a useful one, and I've come across an increasing number of students who have used it. So temporary work via the Tier 5 visa route, and as I mentioned, by going to the government link on the previous page, Tier 5 is covered there, and you can find some more information about it both from the government website and from your own academic institution. Access Tier 5, you can see the organisation which is listed here, is one of several organisations which provide access to temporary work and Tier 5 visa status. And I'll just give you a moment just to have a little read through this to understand how one particular person who became a client services manager at this organisation, the Beans Group, used Tier 5. So just give you a moment just to read that. And again, I'll just check in with Mark to see if we have any questions coming through which you'd like me to take. Hi, hope you just had a chance to read that through. And while I should be clear with you that we're not endorsing Access Tier 5 as an organisation, I'm just including them to raise your awareness that organisations such as Access Tier 5 do exist, and some students have found them helpful in terms of helping them to have this possible Tier 5 visa route, which is an alternative to the Tier 2, the more commonly known route of getting permanent work in the UK. A number of questions coming through about visa routes, and I think it's important that I'm clear that the place to get information around specific visa things is from the qualified staff within your own institution. And you will also find information online, and I think Mark has been putting into the chat box some information about UK CISA and also places where you can get access to that guidelines for employers on what it means to employ people who require a visa. So many employers in the UK do, without question, provide visa support for students. I can see from some of the comments coming into the chat box as well that also certain barriers are being met. Around some types of roles and with some employers, sometimes there are issues in providing visas. Realistically, on this webinar, I'm not in a position to get into the exact details of that or to comment on individual employers' own policies around that. But I would bring you back to this idea of the importance of getting to know employers early and building up your reputation with them in order to be in the strongest position possible to be a competitive candidate for roles in the UK. And moving on from that, I want to bring your attention to this notion now of you as a global graduate, because in working within the UK, as we know from the UK economy, that a lot of the companies, organisations and growth in the UK economy is from companies which, yes, they're based in the UK, but in terms of where their market is and where the industries which they're working within are based, actually they're working on a global basis. And you as international students can market yourself very successfully as global graduates. And I thought this comment from a Director of Talent at PricewaterhouseCoopers summed that up quite nicely. So a global graduate is somebody who can take a global perspective, can work in multidisciplinary, multicultural and multi-locational teams. And you may well, from your own experience, both in education, other work experience or voluntary experience or different activities which you may have done in your home country, have really good evidence of this global perspective and being able to work in multicultural environments. And it's not about having done that in a paid work environment necessarily. It could just be, as I've said, from things that you've done at school or on a voluntary basis or from other activities, sporting or interests. So again, do remember that those are real strengths that you bring to the UK market, which can really open up opportunities for you. Briefly here, I mentioned this earlier, advice from an international student who gained a London role with a major global company. And these were 3 tips that he gave. And I'm going to start from the bottom and work up. So he gave this advice about applying early, remembering that some schemes do open as early as August. And if we're seeing a trend, it's for the schemes to open sooner rather than later. He made a clear point about evaluating your skills, strengths and weaknesses and improve them by doing activities during university and doing some work experience and an internship during university, and through that becoming known to different employers. And then this piece which really mirrors that quote from a senior recruiter about knowing about the company so that you can give relevant information to about the job and your motivation for it that you're applying for. So I know a couple of questions have come in on the chat box around that. That's really the key to showing that you're motivated for an organisation, finding something specific about the company through reading about them, and more than on the website, maybe in the trade press as well, or on the BBC or on different sources related to that industry, so that you can spot something which you generally feel interested in about them and can comment on that. So for example, it might be that they've launched a new product, or if you're interested in the mobile phone industry in the UK, you might comment on the recent changes that there have been in terms of takeover of one organisation by another and the dynamics that are happening in that industry. Lovely way to show that you're interested because you can then comment on those things. Now, I know that we're coming up to time, and we've just got a couple more slides which I'm going to cover with you today. So if you do have any questions outstanding, do please send those in so that we can, I'll do my best to cover them with you, or we can provide you with some relevant information. I wanted to just let you have a couple of tips on current resources. So I mentioned earlier the Job Online website, which is provided by the Careers Group, University of London. Currently, you'll find, for example, over 100 internship roles on that site in sectors from not-for-profit to finance. So it's a really broad range, plus many more permanent roles. So just having a look through that can give you a good feel for the types of roles that are out there. You can also take a look, and one way of selling your skills as a global graduate is by thinking of language needs. It's certainly not the only way, but one way. And this example, the second bullet point down here, for a role which is currently advertised on Target Jobs in a business development role, they've specifically stated that they're looking for people with proficiency in more than one language. And to be proficient at a business level, that often means a degree of fluency, which may come if you are an international student and have developed really strong English language skills through studying here and through other study, but also have fluency in your native language and perhaps in another language as well. So these can be roles that you can be a really strong candidate for. And of course, language needs in a way is shorthand, not only for being able to talk with people, literally, but also that cultural awareness, and coming back to the idea of being a global graduate and being able to relate well, communicate well with people from different cultures, and understanding global needs and how business is done. Final bullet point is an example of a graduate scheme, and it's actually one from Atos. So that's on a website called Milk Round. Here's the link. It's a current vacancy. Now, I included this one because I know that Atos in the past have advertised vacancies and said that they're particularly open to people who need visa sponsorship. I didn't see that wording on their current advertisements, but again, advertisements wordings change and come and go. But this is an employer who I know in the past has been very open to that kind of visa sponsorship, and they offer a range of different roles, and again are an employer who works on a global basis. So these are just 3 different samples of what you can look at, 2 specific opportunities, 2 amongst many hundreds and thousands which are out there, but just to give you a couple of concrete examples to look at. So what I'd like you just to reflect on now are what your next steps are going to be as we close this webinar. What do you take from what we've covered today? And in thinking about that, my suggestions for you are that you really think carefully about who you want to work for. Put yourself in control of your job search by getting a target list of employers together, using different sources such as databases, informational interviewing, research around your target industries to get that list together. Please don't rely purely on advertised vacancies. It's quite tempting to do so, but it doesn't work as effectively as using this broader strategy of mixing advertised vacancies with targeting companies directly. Then think about, well, what works best for you? Which resources are going to work best for you? Which sites? Which trade press? And that I mean industry publications, whether those are printed press or websites, blogs. What actually do you find most informative and useful? Bring that down to a small enough number for you to be able to manage that realistically so that you can be checking in with them every day or every other day so that you can focus on them. One of the challenges of job searching when there is so much information available on the internet is that we can easily spend hours and become lost in the volume of information which is out there, and after perhaps 3 hours take a break and think, well, what have I achieved in those 3 hours? It's a real feature and a challenge of job search, so focusing on key resources for you is a very good way of managing that. And finally, I would wish for you to be really active, remembering that a job will not find you, however good you are. You'll have to go out and search for it, network both in person and via social media for that to happen. And I'd just add to that to be resilient along the way. Not every employer is going to say yes. Lots of them will be interested, and some of them will be able to take that forward into concrete employment opportunities for you. So I'm going to wish you every success with that. and wish you very good luck with your next steps. And in closing today, just refer you to the International Grads into Careers website, where you'll find useful information, a regularly updated blog feed with tips and ideas and current information for you, and that's a great resource. Just as I close, I'm just going to refer to Mark to see if there are any final outstanding questions that it's important for me to tackle. So as I do that, I'll just give you a moment to think for yourself what your next steps are and perhaps just to note those down. Okay, well, it seems like we've been able to tackle most of the questions which have come up, either directly, or I know Mark has been very, very diligently answering questions within the chat box. Really good luck with your next career steps and for finding work and work experience in the UK. Thanks for your time today.